I was up in Baltimore City taking a tour of Baltimore, as I do every couple of years or so, even though I was born and raised there. I always like to take a tour of the city that I grew up in, and was reminded not of the Revolutionary War, but the War of 1812, and that indelible effect that it has had on our nation with Francis Scott Key. If you are not so inclined, Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. So as we remember tomorrow, our freedom, our country, our history, remember a man named Francis Scott Key, a respected young lawyer living in Georgetown just outside of D.C. He made his home there from 1804 to around 1833. With his wife Mary and their 6 sons and 5 daughters. At the time, Georgetown was a thriving town of about 5,000 people just a few miles from the Capitol, the White House, and other federal buildings in Washington, D.C. But after war broke out in 1812, and let me tell you something, the War of 1812 seems to get glossed over some. You've got the Revolutionary War, and some people say, oh, well, then the Civil War, and those are the only real wars that America was truly in. And then, of course, the modern-day warfare of World War I, World War II. A lot of other wars sprinkled in that had a profound effect, and the War of 1812 was one of them. Why? Because war broke out over Britain's attempt to regulate American shipping and other activities while Britain was at war with France. The British had entered the Chesapeake Bay on August 19th, 1814. And by the evening of the 24th of that August, the British had invaded and captured Washington. They set fire to the Capitol and to the White House, flames visible 40 miles away in the city of Baltimore. And in fact, we now call the White House because after the flames were put out, they had to repaint that historic house where the President of the United States lived. President James Madison, his wife Dolly, and cabinet had already fled to a safer location, or in modern terms, an undisclosed location. Such was their haste to leave that they had to rip the Stuart portrait of George Washington from the walls without its frame. Well, a thunderstorm at dawn kept the fires from spreading. The next day, more buildings were burned, and again, a thunderstorm luckily dampened the fires. Having done their work, the British troops returned to their ships and went down the Chesapeake Bay. This time, in the following days, following the attack on Washington, American forces prepared for the assault on Baltimore that they knew would come both by land and by sea. Word reached Francis Scott Key that the British had carried off an elderly and much-loved town physician, Dr. William Beans. He was being held on the British flagship, the Tonnant. The townsfolk feared that Dr. Beans would be hanged, so they asked Francis Scott Key for his help, and he agreed and arranged to have Colonel John Skinner, an American agent for prisoner exchange, to accompany him. On the morning of September 3rd, he and Colonel Skinner set sail from Baltimore aboard a sloop flying a flag of truce approved by President Madison. On the 7th, they found and boarded the Tonnant to confer with General Ross and Admiral Alexander Cochrane. At first, they refused to release Dr. Beans, but Key and Skinner produced a pouch of letters written by wounded British prisoners praising the care that they were receiving from the Americans. Among them, Dr. Beans. The British officers relented but would not release the 3 Americans immediately because they had not seen and heard too much of the preparations for the attack on Baltimore. They were placed under guard, first aboard the HMS Surprise, then onto the sloop, and were forced to wait out the battle behind the British fleet. Now, if you remember your history, let's go back to the summer of 1813 for a moment. At the star-shaped Fort McHenry, which is in the Baltimore Inner Harbor, the commander, Major George Armistead, asked for a flag so big that the British would have no trouble seeing it from a distance. 2 officers, a commodore and a general, were sent to the Baltimore home of Mary Young Pickersgill a maker of colors, and commissioned the flag. Mary and her 13-year-old daughter, Caroline, worked in an upstairs front room, and you can see that, I think, in the Fells Point area of Baltimore, if you ever get to that wonderful city. They don't call it Charm City for nothing. They used 400 yards of best quality wool bunting. They cut 15 stars that measured 2 feet from point to point. 8 red and 7 white stripes, because at the time, they used 15 stripes on the flag and 15 stars representing how many states were in the Union. 2 feet wide, each stripes were. Laying out the material on the Mott House floor of Claggett's Brewery, a neighborhood establishment, the flag was sewn together. By August, it was finished. It measured 30 by 42 feet and cost $405. The Baltimore Flag House, a museum, now occupies the premises. It was restored in 1953. On September 13th at 7 a.m., 1814, the British pounded and pounded and pounded Baltimore's inner harbor. The bombardment began, and the flag was ready to meet the enemy. The bombardment continued for 25 straight hours. 1,500 bombshells weighing as much as 220 pounds and carried lighted fuses that would supposedly cause it to explode when it reached its target. They weren't very dependable and often blew up in midair. But from special small boats, the British fired the new Congreve rockets that traced wobbly arcs of red flame across the sky. The Americans had sunk 22 vessels, so a close approach by the British was not possible. That evening, the cannons stopped. But at about 1 a.m. on the 14th, the British fleet roared to life, lighting the rainy night sky with grotesque fireworks. Key, Colonel Skinner, and Dr. Beans watched the battle with apprehension. They knew that as long as the shelling continued, Fort McHenry had not surrendered. But long before daylight, there came a sudden and mysterious silence. What the three Americans did not know was that the British land assault on Baltimore, as well as the naval attack, had been abandoned. Judging Baltimore as being too costly a prize, the British officers ordered a retreat. So waiting in the pre-dawn darkness, Key awaited for the sight that would end his anxiety. His anxiety that rose and rose and rose throughout the night and culminated with him thinking all was lost when the cannon stopped. The joyous sight of General Armistead's great flag blowing in the breeze, when at last daylight came, the flag was still there. Francis Scott Key, being an amateur poet and having been so uniquely inspired, began to write on the back of a letter he had in his pocket. Sailing back to Baltimore, he composed more lines, and in his lodgings at an Indian Queen hotel, he finished the poem. Judge J.H. Nicholson, his brother-in-law, took it to a printer. Copies were circulated around Baltimore under the title Defense of Fort McHenry. 2 of these known copies actually survive. It was printed in a newspaper for the first time in the Baltimore Patriot on September 20th, 1814, then in the papers as far away as Georgia, as well as New Hampshire. And to the verses was added a note, tune to this song, Anacreon in Heaven. In October, a Baltimore actor sang Key's new song in a public performance and called it what we know it as today, the Star-Spangled Banner. Immediately popular, it remained just one of several patriotic airs until it was finally adopted as our national anthem on March 3rd, 1931. But the actual words were not included in the legal documents. Key himself had written several versions of slight variations, so discrepancy in the exact wording still occur. The flag, our beloved Star-Spangled Banner, went on view for the first time after flying over Fort McHenry on January 1st, 1876 at the Old State House in Philadelphia for the nation's centennial celebration. It now resides in the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of American History. An opaque curtain shields the now fragile flag from light and dust. The flag is exposed for viewing for a few moments once every hour during museum hours.